What's up, guys? Welcome back to another episode of Katson's Corner. This is the show where we take you through what's been going on in college football, where the Chargers have been stopping to make their scouting visits and talking about all things NFL draft. Um, I expect we will probably have some new people joining the show this week, given the state of the Chargers season. Another tough loss on Monday night. It's been a stressful week in general for me. Had to watch that Chargers game. Also got the beautiful UW Oregon game on Saturday, which had my heart racing. So I've been having quite the last few days, but super excited to talk to you guys about some more college football. If this is your first episode of the show, welcome. The way that this works is we'll talk about the games that the Charger Scouts reportedly visited over the weekend. We'll talk about their main draft guy on the team, or at least a guy at a position of need for the Chargers. We'll go into that guy a little bit in depth, and then at the end, I'll give you a couple games for Saturday to preview some matchups. Sometimes it's just guys that I like in the draft to keep an eye on, all that sort of stuff. And so, yeah, it's a good time. Happy to have you. Before we jump into all that stuff, you guys know the deal, everything. Make sure you subscribe to the channel, get all the episodes with Steven, Tyler, Alex, Arjun, me every day, every week. You guys know the drill. If you want to follow me specifically, you can find me at Alex Katson, the way that my name is spelled on the screen. I'm on Twitter. I write for Chargers Wire. I write about some other stuff also sometimes. I'll be starting up my draft content here in a few weeks, hopefully. Just wrote an article about UW that I thought turned out really well. So if you guys want to check that one out as well, you can find it on my Twitter account. But yeah, we will go ahead and get started. Chargers were at 3 games reportedly this week, as well as 1 practice. Some deep cuts from the Chargers scouting staff this week, if I'm being honest. So they were at James Madison versus Georgia Southern in a big Sun Belt matchup. They went to Virginia Tech, Wake Forest, an ACC game between 2 teams in the ACC that are not very good. And then another ACC game, Pitt versus Louisville, where Pitt pulled a pretty big upset against a previously undefeated Louisville team. And then they were also at Western Kentucky practice. I'm not actually sure if that was this week or just at some point this season, but Western Kentucky put out a tweet thanking all 32 teams for coming and stopping by practice during some undefined time period. So the tweet was this week, so we're going to pretend like it happened this week and talk about a guy from Western Kentucky as well. We're going to start with James Madison, Georgia Southern. And on the winning side of that game, James Madison, we will talk about edge Jaylen Green. If you guys remember way back at the very beginning of the series, the Chargers also went to a James Madison practice in week 1 when we talked about their offensive tackle, Nick Kidwell. So moving over to the other side of the ball with Green here. He is a little bit undersized, 6'1", 245, kind of more of that like lower level FBS, high tier FCS sort of pass rusher build. Did have a pretty big game against Georgia Southern. He was kind of a one-man wrecking crew for the Dukes in that one. Had 2.5 sacks, was just kind of all over the field and really contributed to their big-time win there. Does have 8 sacks on the season now, which is his career high by, I think, at least double what his previous was. It is his 6th year in college, so it is, or maybe it's his 5th year in college. He is a senior, 5th or 6th year. And so it is kind of like a men amongst boys sort of narrative thing. Typically with those guys where it's kind of like there's no production until they're a senior, and then all of a sudden they're putting things together. It's just, you can kind of just chalk it up to like, well, he's bigger and more filled out than the 18-year-olds that he's playing against. But with James Madison, it is a little bit more intriguing because this is only James Madison's 2nd year in the FBS. So for the first 3 years or 4 years that Green was on campus, James Madison was an FCS school. They were a very good FCS program, of course, but moved up to the FBS last year, and now Green is producing in the FBS as a senior. And so it's a little bit different because it's like, well, he wasn't productive as a younger guy in an FCS setting, and now he's in an FBS setting, and he's kind of leveled his game up. So something to keep an eye on there of just like, you always want to look for guys that are kind of like stepping up as the stage gets bigger and bigger and bigger. Does have some good pass deflection skills too, really good at getting his hands up in the air. Has 4 pass deflections in his career, mostly over the last 3 seasons. I believe he had one against Georgia Southern as well. Also has 2 interceptions in his career. Again, I think one of those was against Georgia Southern. If not, it was earlier this season. Um, so a guy who's got some pretty good hands, not in the way that we usually talk about for edge rushers, right? Where we talk about hand usage in terms of like beating a tackle, but has pretty good hands as like a deflector receiver type guy, which is kind of a fun little skill set. Excuse me. Um, it's probably going to be a guy that's a UDFA. He's kind of a weird size. Again, like senior breakout. There's a lot of reasons why it won't necessarily be a guy that gets drafted, but someone to keep an eye on as a potential UDFA target. It's the second time the Chargers have gone and seen James Madison in action this season, which is a little bit weird. Um, I just realized that we still have the bolt breakdowns background up, which is very funny. We're going to continue on though with Georgia Southern. Talk about their wide receiver Caleb Hood. He is Georgia Southern's wide receiver 1. He's been their wide receiver 1 for the last couple seasons, averaging 10 yards a catch this season, which basically means that you throw him the ball and he gets a first down. Doesn't matter, first and 10, throw him the ball, first down. Move the chains every time. That's pretty efficient. That's pretty good. Does have some production against big competition. It was held a little bit down in this game against James Madison. I think he went 10 catches for 78 yards, which is still like a pretty decent game, especially for a college receiver. But not up to his usual standards. But Georgia Southern is one of those schools that goes and plays the big out of conference opponents earlier in the year to kind of like raise money to keep their athletic department program going, which a lot of these like lower level G5 schools do to start the year. If you're ever wondering, like, why is Alabama playing USF in the middle of September? It's because USF needs the money to keep their program running. Georgia Southern is one of the schools that does that as well. And in all of those games, Hood has produced at the same level that he does against conference opponents in the Sun Belt, which is always something that you like to see from a lower level guy. You always want to see those guys produce at against top competition, because the NFL, you're going to be asked to produce against top competition every single week. Hood does have some value as a special teams guy too. He's Georgia Southern's kick returner and punt returner. Does mean that he's probably a little bit redundant for the Chargers specifically, who already have a kick and punt returner in Darius Davis, so they drafted him in the 4th round this year. But they don't really have a well-defined backup behind him. And so getting a guy like this, kind of looking at like an Alex Erickson replacement on the practice squad sort of deal, where Erickson is the backup kick returner, punt returner, and isn't really a receiver, but kind of is, and is just kind of hanging out on the practice squad, veteran guy. Hood is a guy that would, potentially come in and replace him for that spot. I do think as a wide receiver, he is going to be pretty slot limited. He's kind of small. He's like 5'9", 180. There are guys like that play on the outside in the modern NFL. I don't think that Hood is going to be one of them, just because he's not really like a natural separator like those guys that are able to do that from the outside are. Georgia Southern manufactures him a lot of separation. There's a lot of motion. There's a lot of like quick game. There's a lot of like kind of gadgety stuff that they do to get him the ball, because he is their best player on offense, despite all of this. And so, a guy who is a fun player, and he's a fun college player to watch, and he's a really good college player to watch. But he is someone who I think is going to have to kind of like grind through that practice squad sort of deal, make a name on special teams, whether that be as a returner or a gunner or what have you, and kind of like fight and claw his way through the NFL ranks that way. If not, he's a guy that I was talking with some friends about on Saturday. I think he will be a dominant receiver in the XFL, which is always fun. And so just a name to file away in case, any of those things end up happening. Moving on to that Virginia Tech Wake Forest game, we're going to kind of segue nicely here with a Georgia Southern transfer to Virginia Tech, and that's cornerback Derrick Canteen here. All-American in 2020 as a redshirt freshman at Georgia Southern. Had a really, really good season during the COVID year. Guy who, like, he has that sort of year. He's an All-American in 2020 at a G5 school. Everyone's talking about, like, when is this guy going to transfer up? You start talking about him as a draft prospect. Like, he's someone that's been on the radar for a couple years. Stays at Georgia Southern, kind of like falls off production wise just because they're not really throwing at him anymore. Kind of like hype dies down a little bit. He's still someone that's on draft radars, but it's kind of like difficult to evaluate him because no one is ever throwing towards him. And then this year, as a fifth-year senior, finally decides to make the jump to Power Five, transfers to a Virginia Tech program that is kind of in a weird, like, rebuilding house money year. They've performed over expectation this year, might make a bowl game. Their quarterback plays improved a little bit, but coming into the year was not like projected to be like a super well-regarded program, and so it was kind of like, well, like we'll see what sort of happens. And honestly, Canteen's been a little bit quiet at Virginia Tech as well. That 2020 season when he made the All-America team, he had 6 interceptions, which was like the most in the country, and it tied a school record, and it was, a very like very big deal, and it was like, wow, look at this guy's ball skills. And he just had his first interception for Virginia Tech on Saturday against Wake Forest with the Chargers in attendance. It was a very good interception. It was in the first quarter of this game. He made a nice sideline play on it, got both feet down. It was an NFL interception. Looked like he was the wide receiver, kind of ran the route for the guy. Really, really high level interception, but it was his first one. And it's not like they haven't been throwing at him while he's been at Virginia Tech either. He has like 20 tackles on the season. Um, After he did get this interception against Wake Forest, though, they kind of did avoid him for the rest of the game. He had no other stats other than this interception. Typically, that either means that like they're not throwing it at you, or they're throwing it at you and you're not making a play. I think that it was mostly the former for Canteen against Wake Forest in this one, where just like they threw the interception to him, and then it was like, okay, let's just look at the other side of the field. Let's just not worry about this guy. Um, Someone who I think is still going to be an NFL player, probably a mid to late round pick if he does get drafted. He's not the best tackler, especially in one-on-one situations, does kind of tend to get broken down a little bit by receivers in open space. Funnily enough, he's actually a much better tackler in run support when there's kind of like a lot happening around him. Not the greatest guy, just kind of like in a one-on-one situation. But he is just like a super high level route recognizer in man coverage. He's a guy that mirrors really well. Like I said earlier, kind of runs routes for receivers really well. Does all the sort of like man coverage things that you really want from an NFL corner. Don't know how proficient he is in zone really. I think that's going to be an area that he's going to need to work on. But someone that I have liked for a little while. Was happy to see him pop back on the radar this week with that interception against Wake Forest. Moving on to the Wake Forest side, we've got corner Caelan Carson. Again, if you're new to this show, you may recognize a theme here of we're talking about a lot of defensive backs, a lot of wide receivers. That is intentional. I think that corner is going to be a huge point of emphasis for the Chargers in this upcoming draft, especially with the way that Michael Davis has been playing and also the fact that he's a free agent after the season. The way that the secondary in general has been playing, the J.C. Jackson trade, everything. Corner seems like it's going to be a big, big point of emphasis. And so we are talking about a lot of them for a reason. Carson is Wake Forest's best corner. He got third round feedback in the spring. And so again, if you're new, the NFL scouts have two different coalition sort of things that they belong to. They both do spring grades for prospects. One of the coalitions are the people that invite guys to the combine. The other one is just kind of like the other one. um, but they evaluate players over the spring. A lot of NFL evaluations are honestly done by the time the season starts, and it's really only like guys that break out, guys that have like huge seasons, guys that are big disappointments that get like moved up and down. But for the most part, most evaluations are done on the NFL side of things. So Carson, third round spring grade. Doesn't mean he's going to be a third rounder in April. Just means that like that's what they thought of him coming into this season. Has been pretty decent this year. Did have a forced fumble against Virginia Tech in this game. The most notable thing about him is that everything is very fast. He plays with his head on a swivel very well, avoids flags at the catch point by getting his head around and defending the ball at the catch point instead of just kind of like running into the receiver and getting a pass interference flag. He's got quick feet, fluid hips, really good underneath for those reasons. Able to kind of like hang with those twitchier guys running shallower routes. He does have a tendency to freelance a little bit. He's kind of a sloppy-ish player. I don't want to call anyone sloppy per se, but like he does have some fundamental stuff that I think he could clean up in order to like be a better player. There's a few times where you can kind of see that he like peels off a man or like is a little bit like outside his zone because he's looking to make a big play. Like he's always looking for a splash play, which is a good thing. But it does like put you at risk, right? Of like it's kind of more like the gambler style of corner. Like think like a Marcus Peters, right? Where it's like, yeah, if you jump this route, then like you get a pick six and it's a huge play for your team. But if you jump it and you're wrong, then it's a touchdown going the other way. And so it's a gamble that you kind of have to play. Um, Carson does kind of have that sort of element to his game, does kind of tend to do that a lot. Um, in zone coverage, I do think he's a little bit late sometimes, just to pass guys off, to kind of like recognize that a guy is in coming into or coming out of his zone. Just a lot of small stuff that I think he could clean up. Nothing like huge, nothing where I'm like, oh, like this is not going to play at the NFL level. He's definitely an NFL caliber athlete. I don't think there's any question about that. But I think it's just something where you're looking to take that athleticism, kind of rein it in a little bit, coach him up a little bit, and someone who could end up being like a very, very good corner in the NFL if he gets the right coaching, I think. Whether or not that's the Chargers, I will leave to your own opinions about what's been going on lately. No comment from me there. But I do like Carson quite a bit. He had a good game against Virginia Tech. If I had to guess one prospect that the Chargers were there to see for like a very random Virginia Tech Wake Forest game between two teams that have not been very good in the ACC this season, I would say it was probably for Carson. So someone to keep an eye on, probably in like the day two, early day three range at corner. Moving on to Pitt Louisville, we'll talk about another corner. This one is MJ Devonshire, whose name you might know because he is the clutch man for Pitt secondary. There are a couple games last season, and I think 2021 as well, where Devonshire just ends the game. I'm pretty sure it was that Pitt West Virginia game. I think it was last season that was the really, really good one, that rivalry game, where Devonshire had the pick six to basically seal the win for Pitt. He had a couple other like pick six plays that season. Has kind of been like the bailout guy for that Pitt defense the last couple years. Did get sixth round feedback in the spring, so definitely looking at like a day three sort of guy. Pitt has produced a lot of NFL DBs the last few years. Credit to their defensive backs coach. I believe his name is Archie Collins. He's done a really good job with that program over the last few years under Pat Narduzzi. You look at guys that have made the league, like Damari Mathis on the Broncos, Jason Pinnock on the Giants, Eric Hallett and Brendan Hill, who are on the Jaguars and the Texans, respectively. A couple other guys have made the league from Pitt in the last few seasons. That secondary has been very good the last few years. Devonshire is kind of the next guy up. He's played with all of those guys, so he's been surrounded by NFL players this whole time. He knows what it takes to be a pro. One of the main concerns here is that like he does have a very wiry frame. He's a very skinny guy, and he knows it. All of the preseason interviews that I could find about him were just him talking about how he was putting weight on this season. He managed to put on 5 whole pounds, which uh, I'm kind of belittling a little bit. It doesn't sound like a lot, right? But like for a guy that's that skinny and that wiry, it does matter a little bit, more than I'm giving it credit for, I think. And it has shown up a little bit this season, I think. That said, his strength at the catch point is still a concern. He's someone that can definitely get out muscled on some of those 50-50 balls and make them more 60-40 towards the receiver. Does add some value as a punt returner. He's had a couple big punt returns in big spots. Again, just kind of like one of those guys that rises to the occasion when the lights get the brightest. And super attractive length and speed combo. He's got, I think it's 33-inch arms is the unverified measurement that I could find. Probably going to run in like the 4.4s or so. I think that this is a guy that you're probably looking to put in the slot in the NFL. Don't know how he's going to hold up on the boundary just because of those catch point concerns that I have. But someone that I do like quite a bit. You always like those guys that rise to the occasion, like I was talking about. And so someone to keep an eye on for sure a little bit further down the board. Moving on to Louisville, we'll talk about a guy that was going up against Devonshire a decent amount in that game, and that's wide receiver Jamari Thrash. Another Sun Belt transfer here. He transferred to Louisville this season from Georgia State. And so Thrash is a fifth-year senior this season, in his fourth season in college, which was last year. His redshirt junior season at Georgia State. Excuse me. Had a big year. Kind of exploded on the scene. Had like 1,100 yards. Enters the portal as a grad transfer. Ends up at Louisville and has continued that momentum, which, like we talk about, is always something that you want to see from lower level guys when they make that jump up to P5 competition. You always want to make sure that those guys are keeping that level of production, if not like maybe coming back down to earth a little bit, but not a ton. Thrash has been Louisville's best receiver. He's been a big reason why Louisville was undefeated coming into this game with Pitt. Receiver that I really like. Stacks corner super easily. What do I mean by stacking a corner? Basically just means like gets behind a guy. Gets behind corner super easily, pushes them upfield, has really good body control. So Louisville's quarterback, Jack Plummer, is not the most accurate guy in the world, but Thrash bails him out on a lot of throws, just kind of contorts his body, keeps his toes in on the sideline, makes a lot of like circus catches, really fun player in that regard. Is pretty versatile in the way that Louisville uses him as a route runner. There's a lot of vertical stuff, but also like a lot of just like, let's get the ball in this guy's hands and let him work. A little bit inconsistent as a separator and not the best as a contested catch guy. He does have that body control and everything, but does have like, I don't know if it's weak hands per se, but just like has a little bit of trouble when guys are kind of like in his grill at the catch point. Gets a little bit more difficult for him. So again, I think it's going to be someone that you kind of have to manufacture touches for as like a vertical guy or as like kind of more of a yak threat, which is weird because he's not really like a big like explosive player. But he's a guy that I really like. I think that all of these same sort of criticisms about like, oh, like is his game going to translate to the NFL? You could have also said when he was transferring up from Georgia State and he's produced at Louisville. And so someone who I like quite a bit, probably thinking like maybe as high as the third round, but probably looking at like a day 3 receiver, just like another body to add in the room. But that's exactly what the Chargers need. And so someone to keep an eye on for sure. Moving on here to Western Kentucky, the team that the Chargers attended practice for. We're going to talk about Malachi Corley, who's one of the best group of 5 receivers in the draft period. Was number 81 on Bruce Feldman's Freaks list. It's the list of the best college football athletes in the country. He does 101 of them normally. Corley clocked in at 81 here. Premier yak threat guy, led the nation in yards after catch last season. Also forced 40 missed tackles in 12, 13 games. So you think about the math there, and that's like three or four a game. So really impressive in that regard. Built more like a running back. He's 5'11", 220. Came into college at like 5'11", 185, and now he's up to 5'11", 220, which is pretty insane. Still has 4.4 speed despite that, but also is like built up the strength to really like break tackles as like a legit just like run through you sort of guy. And so really, really enticing set of physical tools. The lofty comparison that's been thrown around is Deebo Samuel. People have talked about like Brandon Ayuk. People have talked about Amon-Ra St. Brown. So like pretty good company for his name to be in. Obviously, that's like a best case like ceiling scenario. I'm not saying like he's going to come into the NFL and be those guys right away. And some of the main reasons for that are like he plays in a very simplistic offense. Western Kentucky runs the air raid. A lot of their throws are predicated upon getting the ball out super quickly. Through 5 games, a couple weeks ago, he had like 20 targets behind the line of scrimmage. And so he's someone where it's just like get him the ball and let him be a running back essentially. And he's not a super quick accelerator, despite the fact that he's got 4.4 speed. Kind of takes a little while to get up to gear there. And so you worry a little bit about the way that he's going to win vertical routes in the NFL. But overall, like very exciting Saturday player at the very least. I think that he's someone that's gone underrated in draft circles. Someone who's probably going to end up being like a day 2 pick, probably a top 100 sort of guy. Has had a really good season for Western Kentucky. Again, if you put a gun to my head and you ask me like, hey, who were the Chargers looking at Western Kentucky when they went to practice? I would probably say Malachi Corley. All right. So, talking about next week's games coming up this Saturday, we've got a couple big ones on tap. Obviously, the biggest one is probably going to be Penn State versus Ohio State. Marquee matchup in that one to watch, especially Chargers related, is going to be corner Caelan King for Penn State versus Ohio State's Marvin Harrison Jr. You guys know the deal with Marvin Harrison Jr., I assume, at this point. He's the best receiver in the draft. He's Marvin Harrison's kid. He's insane. He's going to be a top 5 pick. The Chargers are not going to be able to get him. That is not the reason that this is on the list. The reason that this is on the list is because Caelan King, who's a guy that we've talked about before, the Chargers have been to 3 different Penn State games this season, is someone that the Chargers are going to be in range for, especially towards the end of the first round where you think the Chargers should be picking. He's got a really big opportunity to solidify himself as like corner 1 in this class if he has a good game against Marvin Harrison Jr. And if he has a good game against Marvin Harrison Jr., it makes it a lot more likely that Penn State wins that game. And if Penn State wins that game, Penn State might make the playoff. If Penn State makes the playoff, that's even more chances for King to get some like real deal NFL caliber talent exposure. And so it's one of those games that like really has the potential to like stack upon itself for like a draft stock for a guy like Caelan King. Not on here, but some other guys worth watching. I think JT Tuimoloau, however you say his last name, right? The Ohio State edge rusher. He's got a big matchup with Olufushanu, that the Penn State tackle, who's going to be a top 5 pick as well. That's another one to watch if you're looking for like another like sort of like second round edge rusher for the Chargers to take another shot on. Minnesota, Iowa, kind of in that 12:30 Pacific slot. Not like any marquee matchups per se, but a couple guys worth talking about for sure. Minnesota's got a tight end, Brevin Spann-Ford, who is pretty decent. He's been in college forever at this point. Been on draft radars for a long time. Is like 6'7", 260 something, like just huge. More of a blocking tight end than a receiver. You won't see Minnesota throw him the ball a ton, although they will because they have no one else to throw the ball to. But more of a blocking tight end, which is, I don't know if you've watched the Chargers recently, exactly what the Chargers need. So he's a guy that I definitely have circled as like a priority watch for final grade for Chargers purposes. Minnesota's also got safety Tyler Nubin, who might be the top senior safety in the country. Probably more of like a 3rd, 4th round sort of guy. But that's perfect for the Chargers, who have bigger needs, but also like need to add depth at safety. We've seen that with the way that the injuries have gone down this season. So someone worth keeping an eye on as well against a pretty bad Iowa offense. So he should have a pretty good game. And then on the Iowa side, can't go without mentioning Cooper DeJean, who I just have listed as a defensive back here. Kind of plays a hybrid corner, safety, linebacker, do it all, everything role for the Hawkeyes. Another guy who's going to be in that conversation kind of late first round as a secondary piece for the Chargers to add. Was surprised that I hadn't talked about him on the show before. I think I have, probably just like in passing, but not in sort of any in-depth sort of way. Really impressive player. I think that, his tape speaks for itself. Just flip that game on. I think it's the best one happening at 12:30, really, other than maybe like Alabama, Tennessee. He should have a good game. Minnesota's offense is also not very good. Should be a defensive struggle in that one, which if you like that sort of thing, that's the game for you. Duke, Florida State, another big ranked matchup. I'm hoping Riley Leonard, Duke's quarterback, plays in this one because it'll add some extra juice to it. But Duke does have a pretty nice center, Jacob Monk, who made Feldman's Freaks list as well. And so he's a guy to keep an eye on, especially against a Florida State defensive line that's pretty good. Florida State's got a running back, Trey Benson, who's kind of like a 2nd, 3rd round sort of guy. So got to watch if you are interested in finding a guy to either complement or replace Austin Eckler in 2024. And then Keon Coleman, what can you say about this guy that hasn't already been said? He's been fantastic this year after transferring in from Michigan State. Had to put him on here. Again, someone who I think is probably going to go before the Chargers' first round pick, although the way that the season is going these days, maybe the Chargers will be in the top 15. Maybe they'll be able to get Coleman. But, appointment television anytime that he's on screen. And then the last game here, 7:30 Pacific time, Montana State versus Sacramento State. Yes, I'm telling you to watch FCS football. Montana State, number 2 in the country. Sacramento State, number 3. It's a big-time matchup in the FCS, and there's some NFL players in this game. Marshall Martin is a tight end for Sacramento State. He's been limited by injury this season, but finally got back healthy last week and had one of his best games of the year. I expect him to have a big role against Montana State. Montana State's got a fullback tight end, sort of like hybrid guy, Derek Snell. who is, probably going to be more of a special teams guy in the NFL. But I did find an interview with him that said that his favorite player growing up was LaDainian Tomlinson. So we love him for that. Hope he's a Charger. And then Sacramento State's leading tackler, Armand Bailey, the linebacker, first team All Big Sky last season. Someone that NFL scouts are going to be familiar with from watching that Sac State defensive tape for Marte Mapu last year. He's had a good year to start this season as well. Going to be a big deal in terms of stopping Montana State's offense. That's going to do it for this week, guys. Hope you enjoyed as always. Again, make sure you're subscribed to the channel, hit the notification bell, do all the stuff, follow everyone on Twitter, follow me on Twitter. You can find it just the way that my name is spelled. I'm sure it's in the description and everything as well. You guys know all the stuff. We'll be back again next week to talk about another week of college football, talk about some more prospects. And until then, I will see you guys later. Peace.